Now that we know how artificial intelligence works, we know how the neural network works, we know that we need big data to train it. Now let's look at applications that we have for digital health and psychiatry. And we will look at three areas. We'll look at pathophysiology, we'll look at an impact on diagnosis, and of course we will look at the impact that this will have on treatment. And let's start with diagnosis, because here psychiatry has a specific problem that will especially benefit from the advent of artificial intelligence and of big data. The problem is that our current diagnostic classifications are optimized for clinical reliability and applicability. Our current diagnostic schemes, the DSM and the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases, and the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that we use in psychiatry, arose from a realization that psychiatrists in different countries and continents often did not agree on what to diagnose a given patient with. And in order to solve that, there are now very sophisticated manuals that contain precise definitions of a diagnosis with inclusion and exclusion criteria that ensure that if I diagnose a patient and a colleague diagnoses a patient on the other side of the world, we would usually come to the same conclusion. However, the criteria that are used in these classifications are based on clinical observation. They're based on things that patients report to us. They're based on things like course criteria, how long does a given episode last, things like that. And so they do not reflect the underlying mechanisms. They're far away from the biology, from the risk and resilience landscape that shapes diagnoses, and that means that both the quality of the diagnosis and the efficiency of using it for treatment will have to depend on looking under a given diagnosis onto what the individual risk and resilience landscape is like, what that specific patient needs. So we need to go to what's also called precision medicine approach. We can no longer say this patient has depression. We need to understand why, through what pathophysiology, through what pathways does that patient arrive at that depressive episode. There is a proposal initiated by the National Institute of Mental Health, the NIMH in the USA, called the Research Domain Criteria Project, which aims to do something like that. And the goal of the RDoC, as that project is also called, is to define basic mechanisms of functioning studied across diagnoses and across multiple units of analysis. It says here in the original description, from genes to circuits to behaviors, in order to find processes that someone with depression may or may not have, and that's going to be important to treat that patient with depression, but the same process could also be present in someone with a completely different diagnosis. And to the degree that our treatments are aimed at these processes and not the diagnosis, this is important for precision medicine and will help to translate the progress that we have in neurobiology into an improved understanding of psychopathology, what underlies psychiatric diagnosis, new ways to classify psychopathology, new ways to do the diagnosis, then most importantly, to find the optimally matched treatment. So this is a proposal that some have seen as a counter-proposal to current diagnosis, and I think personally that's probably not quite the best way to use this idea. Probably for a long time these two things will be complementary. We will use our current diagnosis, but we will also try and use an approach like this to understand with more precision what underlies the given diagnosis. And this cartoon shows you the general idea. What you see on the left are three diagnoses, and the differently colored people are meant to represent differing pathophysiologies, differing underlying processes that are captured under these diagnoses. And the fact that the colors are repeating in the three diagnoses is meant to show you that a given process can appear in a bunch of diagnoses. So you have a lot of variability both within the disease and across the diseases. And in order to capture that, you really need a big data approach that is intended to be shown by that cube down there. You want to capture the various data sources, from genetic to clinical information to imaging, maybe to measuring people's behavior in a large data cloud. And artificial intelligence is the ideal way to look into that cloud and to find out the complexity that's within and sort these diagnoses into what's called an endophenotype. And what that word means, phenotype is something in this context like a disease process. Endo means that it's hidden, that it is a biological process that I don't directly see. And now you see that the people are nicely sorted into colors, which is meant to show that we have found the underlying processes that we can then use for precision treatment. Maybe group 1 will need an antipsychotic, group 2 may need a specific psychotherapy, group 3 might need watchful waiting, and so on. So we can use that general approach, which artificial intelligence underpins, to do precision medicine, to do clinical predictions that can be used for early detection, the choice of treatment, and potentially also for a prognostic assessment, something that our current diagnoses are notoriously bad at. The second part that we would like to discuss, where artificial intelligence and neural networks are quite useful, is in understanding the pathophysiology. The reason that is that two things meet in psychiatry are both studying the brain and the complexity of the brain, and we're using artificial neural networks, which are the technology underlying artificial intelligence, to perform artificial intelligence. So, if you will, both the way of studying and the topic of study actually come together in the sense that they are brain or brain-like. And one example that I would like to give you where using neural networks has been very helpful in understanding how psychiatric disorders come about, what the pathophysiology is the known link between genes and psychiatric disorders. So like any disorder, psychiatric disorders have a heritable component. That component can vary, and it does vary. There are disorders where the genetic component is very large, for example in autism or in bipolar disorder, or to some degree in schizophrenia. The majority of the illness risk is genetic, and in some other disorders, like for example depression or anxiety disorders, the majority of the risk is not genetic, it's environmental. But there's always a component of genetic risk, and geneticists become very good at finding those genes. And the task then for psychiatrists or psychiatric researchers is, okay, how do these genes actually work? And there's a lot of information that we know about how genes influence the behavior of cells, of neurons, what they do to neurotransmitters or ion channels and things like that. And we also know quite a bit on how the way the brain works impacts psychiatric disorders, because we understand through cognitive neuroscience quite a bit on how cognitive processing, information processing in the brain is linked to normal and altered behavior. But there is a big gap between understanding single cells and components of cells and understanding the brain as a whole, what's called here the macroscopic brain dynamics, things that we can see, for example, in imaging. And here, neural networks are very helpful because we can link them up both to the way cells function, which we can then model as components of these neural networks. We can then take the output of those neural networks up to produce some kind of macroscopic dynamics to link it into cognition. So they form a, if you will, critical missing link in research between the level of description of cells and genes and the level of descriptions of the brain as a whole, cognition and altered behavior. One specific example of this I would like to show you concerns prediction error and delusions. So prediction error is the basic mechanism underlying learning new things. If I go up in the morning and everything is exactly as I expected it, then I haven't learned anything new when I go to bed. In order to learn something new, I need to have something unexpected happen to me, so that I need to adjust my representation of the world, and I need to notice that something unexpected happened. That's called a prediction error. The world didn't behave as I expected it to. And prediction error is what needs or leads me to update my representation of the world, as you can see here, so my model of the world gets better. And we know that in the brain, that critical signal that tells me, hey, here's something important, pay attention to this. Here's something not as you expected is a burst of dopamine in parts of the subcortical structures of the brain. There was a major discovery by Wolfram Schultz. It was made in primates, but the same thing applies to humans. That brief burst of dopamine tells me something's important, attend to this, and it is the thing, the event that causes me to update my representation of the world because I think it is important. Now, interestingly, in schizophrenia, what we think is happening is that salient signal, as we also say, that brief burst of dopamine that says something's important, is chaotically upregulated. It happens not just when something is actually unexpected, it happens randomly throughout the day, but it triggers the same kind of response. You attend to it and you wonder what's going on there. And if you imagine you're getting this salient signal, you're getting this impression something is important, and you're looking there and nothing's going on, you just see people talking or you see cars driving by, that is what leads you to the road to a delusion. You start to think, okay, something's going on. These people are really talking about me. These cars are being sent after me because you're getting this dysregulated salient signal. And this is something that you can study and that you can quantify through neural networks. So in summary, this kind of network control theory is an important development not only to understand pathology, psychopathology in psychiatry, but also to find new treatments, because new treatments are often aimed at trying to stabilize a given brain state and to prevent a sudden switch, for example, a switch into mania, from happening. And as it turns out, this is a very useful approach to find both how existing and how new drugs work. So it's going to impact the development pipeline of translational psychiatry. So it's probably going to benefit all of us when we treat patients in the future.